Hello, everyone. I will be absent in a couple of weeks, so I want to make sure I push out as many recordings as I can to not only cleanse my brain of the thoughts that I have, but also because I want to make sure that you all have something. I've been very sporadic due to just how life's been. Okay, so let's go and discuss what hasn't been mentioned by other people regarding 3rd Gen Ryzen. It seems most people have a focus on the hardware side as of late, which is fine. I prefer somebody else explaining that than me. But anyways, I'll link this article and the other ones you'll see in just a second. The MSI CEO is basically saying that even low-end X570 motherboards will be expensive. Now, this is an older article, but this kind of gave us something to keep in mind as new information came in. And not too long ago, I started seeing prices for those motherboards. It would appear that the lowest X570 that I can find of, based on posted information or leaks, is $190. Some people will say that, oh, that's pretty normal pricing, but the people who are saying that are the people who do extreme builds, such as overclocking and things like that. For the average consumer, 190 is not normal. Back during the X470 days, the most that you really should have spent as a normal consumer, not doing anything crazy like overclocking, would have been between 120 to 140 on the motherboard. The Gigabyte Aorus X470 Ultra Gaming, I think is the model, was considered the best all-round motherboard for X470. But yeah, so that is quite the price hike. Another thing too to keep in mind is the B550 is not going to release next month. It'll be coming out a much later date, which is unfortunate to see. That's just the motherboard side. Let's go ahead and talk about the platform itself and the interaction of the parts. Now, it would seem the X570 is keeping a similar configuration as the X470, in which it has at least one M2 SSD connected to the CPU. I can't remember if I mentioned this in prior recordings, so I'll just go ahead and briefly mention it. This is actually a great bonus to have, because what it allows you to do is it allows you to use an SSD specifically for games. You can plug in a hard drive for the operating system. That's because the SSD is going to the CPU and the hard drive is going to the chipset. That means there won't be any bottlenecking in an HCI configuration. It's a bit backwards than what most builds have been doing up to this point, but there's a good reason for that. It's because of the fact that you have to look at data retention, and just the fact that solid-state drives definitely do not last as long as hard drives. Then you can branch out into a pretty long discussion about security if you really want to. But we're not going to do that. So this allows you to do a unique setup, as I was mentioning. And in that scenario, if you really want a simpler explanation, I'm basically saying that it allows you to change where the speed is. Originally, when computers were built with the SSD for the operating system, that was just to give you a faster boot time. So now, instead of doing a faster boot time, we're devoting the speed towards the games, which is going to be what you want to do, I think, in the coming months due to how much bigger games are getting. I would say an ideal configuration using this very unique setup would be running a Crucial MX500 500GB M2 SSD with either a 500GB or 1TB Western Digital or Seagate hard drive. Store everything but the games on the hard drive, and then throw everything on the solid state. And there you go, you have faster games. Okay, so moving on now. You'll notice this article is kind of long, and it goes over some of the more finer things. But what you want to look at is where the changes are. You'll notice that there's a wattage change in the motherboards, first and foremost. But then you'll notice that down here they kind of go into further detail about the differences in between X470 and X570. So if you have to make the decision of saving money on the motherboard so you can buy other parts, then this is kind of where you should be looking on this article. There's a lot to go here, but I'll let you read for yourself, but I'm just kind of pointing you to where you want to look. It's the bottom part of this chart. Okay, so yeah, motherboards discussed, unique interaction. Now let's move on to APUs. This is where things have really gotten interesting, and I'm surprised there hasn't been more of a discussion on it. I've looked all over the internet, and I can't find any mention of the RX 580. I was half expecting an RX 580 refresh for 1080p gamers, but there isn't one that I can find of. It would seem that the only video cards that AMD is concerned with this year is Navi. Navi's a GDR6, and it was more or less built for 2K gaming. Well, not everybody's going to be able to afford that. There's a reason that the vast majority of gamers are on 1080p. It's because that's all people can afford for that, and that's completely fine. You know, I don't think that there's anything wrong with sticking with 1080p. But this brings us back to the APUs, because if AMD is not going to be refreshing the king of 1080p video cards, which is the RX 580, then that indicates that AMD is going to rely on APUs. And sure enough, not too long ago, articles start popping up about APUs being on the Matisse platform. Matisse is the name of 3rd gen Ryzen's. Now, when you read this article, keep in mind that the APUs for Ryzen have always been a generation behind. So the 2nd gen APUs actually weren't on the 12 nanometer architecture. They were on the 14 nanometer architecture. The 3rd gen Ryzen's this year are on the 12 nanometer architecture instead of the 14. So you can see that AMD is recycling their older architectures and using that for the APUs. So there is a chance that AMD will be waiting until next year to implement 7 nanometer to the APUs. This article and a few others mention that this is just a way of AMD bringing low cost to the market, but honestly, I think they should be taking this a lot further. I don't see any reason why they shouldn't. And here's why. One of the great things about APUs is that they don't require a video card to run. They can run on integrated graphics just fine. The 2400G in particular is able to run most esports games at 60 frames per second. It's clearly a very powerful APU that's capable of doing games within reason. Then you have to also factor in the cost. Because you don't need a video card, and you really only need RAM for it, well, that reduces your costs even further. So this is kind of why I'm saying that stuff. AMD shouldn't be trying to do cheap APUs. They should be trying to do expensive APUs. That way they have something that can run 1080p games and just completely ignore doing video cards for 1080p for eternity. I think that that would be completely fine. Even if an APU on 7 nanometer costs, let's just say, $250, $300, that's not a big deal. Because look at the cost of what it would take to do, let's just say a streaming and gaming setup for 1080p. Well, if you use the AMD 3600 non-X with, let's just say, an RX 570, you're going to be looking at a cost of between $850 to $950, depending on how you do it. Hand-built, of course. So if you can offer an APU that's $250 or even $300 that can essentially absorb the cost of the video card, or at least roll into one, I should say, then that's completely fine. Because then you don't have to worry about additional costs for, buying a CPU and GPU. So yeah, combined cost of a 3600 and an RX 570 would be in the ballpark range of $440. Yeah, so even if an APU spiked up to $300, I mean, you're still saving $140 right there, is what it boils down to. So, yeah, if anything, I hope that people ask for that. But yeah, that's the most that I have on what hasn't been discussed. I'm sure that more will pop up at a later time, but for now, that's all that's really there for me to discuss. Thanks for listening.